I was recently asked by a nice young man to build him a GASLANDS vehicle. He wanted a multi-wheeled tank truck combo, inspired by a movie that he'd seen. As in any conversion, we have to do the teardown phase first to come up with the elements that we need. So I began with these two twin race cars, this off-road truck, and this goofy-looking toaster truck. And so, as per usual, out comes the Dremel tool and the destruction begins. I know I could make my life a little easier by using all plastic cars, but to be honest, I do love figuring out how to blend the metal and the plastic parts together and make it look decent. With the twins torn down, it was time to move on to the other two, which I did off camera because watching some old guy drill holes is not riveting television. The very first modification was to remove the rack on this truck for later use. Now I'll tell you, these little boogers get hot when you're cutting them up. So I keep a small container of water and a dry rag handy to dip the car in for a quick cool off when doing this stuff. Now I suppose I could wear cut-proof and heat-resistant gloves when doing this, but I grew up in the 70s and 80s, if you're picking up what I'm throwing down. Some fine-tuning on some of the pieces was needed before moving forward on this project. I grabbed this guy because I felt that incorporating his little roll cage would look really cool in the finished product. Having my basic plan on how all this was going to go together to make the tank truck, it was time to revisit the twin race cars to get a frame built for this bad boy. I liked the wheels on the race cars. I kept a low profile for the tank that I was building, and the rims looked pretty good, but I was going to need a lot wider of a wheelbase, so the original axles were going to have to go. The wire I used for the new axles is actually off of Chinese takeout boxes. You know, the small boxes of rice. That wire is a good all-purpose wire for hobby projects. After using my pin vise to bore out the holes a little bit larger to accommodate the new axles, we were on our way to getting this bad boy on the road. Before we could mount the axles and the wheels, it was a little matter of stretching the frame. This modification would allow for the addition of another rear axle. I knew this part was going to take a bit of fitzing and futzing around. Not only was I stretching the frame, but I also wanted to use the clips for holding the axle and have the two rear axles evenly spaced and looking correct. So there was a lot of cutting, grinding, and dry fitting to get everything just where I wanted it. When it came time for gluing, I had a bit of a height difference, so I used the washer to even out the two pieces. And as usual, I used baking soda with super glue for a fast set and also for a real solid bond. Because my connection between my frame pieces was so small, I decided to add some extra insurance and support by applying some milliput. As you can see, off camera, I added the beginnings of a frontal assault rack by using a couple of olive forks. I also did some trimming and sanding for a proper fit for the additional pieces I still have to apply. And also, I used some plastic card to cover up these holes and add to surface area that I can adhere to. Once that was done, it was time for the wheels and axles so we can have ourselves a rolling chassis, and then start fitting the body parts onto the chassis. And with the addition of our last 2 tires, there we have it. We are now ready to build upon this and make our heavy-duty road warrior come to life. First up is fitting the cab of the vehicle. The cab I chose isn't an exact copy of the front end of the vehicle that Harry, my young friend, gave me as a reference, but it is big and beefy, and I feel that it will fit the aesthetic of this build very well, and I'm hoping Harry will feel the same way. To get this cab to fit on the chassis, there was a lot of cutting, trimming, and shaping involved. Some builds seem to go together without many alterations at all, and just kind of fit together like a kit. This build, however, turned out to be more of a jigsaw puzzle that I had to make specific pieces for. By the time I'd cut away the fenders, some of the hood, and the grille and headlights, there wasn't much of that original cab left. I even broke out some needle nose pliers to hold on to this thing, to save my fingers from the heat as well as possibly cutting them with the Dremel tool. You see that? That's my safety portion of this video. I decided to hack this plastic gator to pieces and use it to mount my cab to the frame. I'd already robbed the roll cage off it, so I figured it was fair game. What the heck, right? There was a lot of trimming, chopping, and shaping done to this piece to get it to just right to where my cab was set on top of it. This gator piece had a channel running through it, so to maximize my surface area to glue to, I filled it with this heavy paper material. I then gave it and the chassis a liberal amount of glue. With the cab situation looking pretty good, it was time to work on the rear end of our tank truck. I had a little trimming to get rid of the fenders, and deciding how I was going to incorporate the original roll cage assembly of the truck into this new rear half of the vehicle. After futzing around a little bit and with a little extra trimming to make the rack fit better, I decided to secure the cab into its position first before attaching the rear half, so I'd have a solid assembly to attach it to once I'd decided on a definite plan. I always start with a pretty good idea of how my finished vehicle is going to look, and sometimes I do some sketches, but it always seems that the build will throw you a curveball or two, and I end up modifying my original concept of how everything is going to go together. The first steps to connecting the cab was going to be some cab risers to level the cab to match the elevation of where my hood was going to be. Rather if it's making shims like I am now, or bumper hooks, or armor panels on GASLANDS conversions, to a multitude of other uses when making dioramas, these plastic bread ties are a great item to have around. Of course, before attaching the cab, I needed some window screen to serve as protection for the occupants. You can't wander around causing motorized mayhem without protection over your open windows. I prefer to use super glue gel for this, Because it's easier to apply and control and spread out, I just use a small piece of plastic, like here, using the rest of an olive fork, and I tuck the screen into all the tight spots and brace it wherever I can. The glue tends to melt the screen a bit, which is actually useful here. Then, after adhering it all to the spots that I can get to, I take some sharp scissors and cut the remainder off, and I use the handle of a pair of tweezers to shape the rest so there are no frayed ends jutting out. Some vehicles can be done with one piece, slick and easy, unlike this paint in the rear, where I had to do the side windows separate. When I find myself in this situation, I tend to favor brush-on glue over gel. Okay, there we are. Not looking too shabby, I'd say. Now we need to find out a way to incorporate the Gator's roll cage into the mix before we build onto the rest of this big road beast. I know I want it to totally encompass the cab, and the only solution I see is drilling some holes for the cage to come up through the body as if it was welded to the frame below. So, quick fit and some marks to guide me where I need to put the holes, and we're on our way. After a test fit, I decided I didn't want the lights on top of the roll cage, so chop chop, or in this case, snip snip. When test fitting the roll cage, I realized that I'd had a bit of a gap at the back of the cab, so I decided to use some more screen to build in a shim to even things out. That also makes sense with the build, but in all actuality, it probably won't even be visible when all said and done anyway. But with that problem resolved, I could now glue on the roll cage. I once again used the tried and true method of baking soda and super glue. It works wonders when you're trying to meld plastic and metal parts together on these builds. I'd also used a bit of screen as a shim before getting ready to mount the cab on the frame, and I got to work on some more additional spikes for the assault rack on the front of our mechanical menace. Again, using more of the little plastic olive forks. And since I had totally obliterated the front of the cab at the beginning of this video, I was now burdened with the task of building an entire grille and front end for this beast. So, naturally, I decided to cannibalize the original chassis that the truck came on in the first place. There was a lot of snipping, cutting, fit testing, and just general fitsing and futzing to get the look that I was going after, but in the end, I think it really paid off cannibalizing that original frame to get the look that I wanted. By the time that I'd slashed and trimmed this piece down to where it would fit, it needed some propping up and reinforcement. Oh, and some big guns were needed before the cab went on. Harry had insisted on lots of firepower for this bad boy, so I was not going to let him down. I also scabbed the original engine for the cab and needed some minor modifications done to it before it would fit onto the build, but now it sits even higher than it did before, and it looks pretty sick. I was going to say badass. That's more of my term, a 1980s term. Before it could be added, there were some voids that I had to fill, so I just used some plastic screen and soaked them with glue, making sure also to fill the gap in the back of the engine as well. I returned to what was left of the truck's original parts to start building the rear end of this vehicle. After some modifications, removing excess material, scoring off roughed edges, and a fit test, I realized I was going to need to level up the tail end. So I got to work solving that problem by using the box from the Gator I'd been scavenging from. The fact that I could actually utilize the screw from the Gator piece was an added bonus when attaching it to the build. It was then more snipping and trimming to get this flatbed attachment mounted onto the frame to be able to build up from there. With the flatbed on, I needed to turn Mr. Goofy Toaster Truck into something cool and vicious now. In hindsight, I may have spared Mr. Toaster Truck if he could have actually made BLTs. I'd definitely have given him a pass then. Now that the main body of the war machine has been assembled, some of the extra details could be added, like this huge rear bumper to shield the rear tires from enemy assault. I broke out the milliput again for some gap filling and body work on this Frankenstein of a truck. The Nivea cream helps the tools glide over the milliput without sticking or pulling it out of crevices. I also used it on the undercarriage and to help reinforce the assault rack to make sure that the spikes were rock solid. And speaking of reinforcements, the roll cage I'd cut off of the cab in the beginning of the video was finally being incorporated into the build. But I didn't just want open air underneath of it. Among its new purpose was also to be a base for some heavy-duty weaponry to come. When it came time to attaching the roll cage to the toaster truck, I really didn't have a great way to make it work as well as I would have liked, but I did have quite a bit of surface area to contact, so I drowned it in super glue and added a large amount of baking soda. But as you can see, I did the majority of it out of frame. I'm getting really good at this YouTube stuff, let me tell you. And here you see, or you don't, more pro footage as an example. The cardboard that I used had print on one side and a gloss coating. So to add a bit of backbone to it, I soaked the opposite side with super glue before mounting it onto the flatbed behind the cab. After adding the toaster truck roll cage thingy addition, I needed a shim of sorts and a way to cap off the front end of the addition, so I cut it out of plastic. Sun's out, guns out. Time to add some firepower to this six-wheeled mechanical monstrosity. It occurred to me as I was gap filling that the front fenders were going to be a bit problematic. Either I made them from cardboard, plastic card, or some other plastic material, or go to the store and search for a vehicle I could scavenge some fenders off of. Then the answer hit me like a truck. Just build them on a milliput. You don't know how. You've never done it before. What do you have to lose? No one's ever going to see it. All primed and ready to paint. Oh, how I love this part. I put a decent amount of work into this build, and it always feels good to see that primer coat go on, blending all the different materials and colors together. Before this unifying coat, everything still looks so unrelated and slapped together. This was my first time trying P3 paints. I was visiting Wanderers Hall in Fairfield, Iowa, and picked up some P3 paints and inks. Ironically, purple was one of the colors I'd picked, not knowing that in this project, purple would be a color that would be suggested I use. Wanderers Hall is a great place. If you're in the area, I would definitely recommend checking this place out. They're on Facebook and Instagram that I know of, and I will have links and info about them in the description. The other color of P3 that I'd snagged at Wanderers Hall was coal black. I wanted to give the huge rear bumper some more character than just rusty old metal or a solid paint color. so I decided a hazard sign would be a decent choice. I started by layering on a nice bright yellow. I grabbed some Reaper Shining Mithril. The P3 purple was gorgeous, but it just wasn't hitting on all cylinders for me for this project, so I decided to do some experimentation. Adding the Shining Mithril would slightly tint the purple, changing its hue, while also adding a metallic sheen. You've probably noticed me dipping into the darker purple on my wet palette as well. The coal black shades the beaten purple. Man, you just have to love that name, beaten purple. Anyway, shading it with the blue-black hue of the coal black is a sweet combo. I also picked up these nail art brushes at Wanderer's Hall. I'd been wondering for a while if these would be helpful in our hobby, and so had Pat at Wanderer's Hall. So far, I'd say a definite yes, and I'm looking forward to using them on miniatures and some terrain builds that I have planned for future videos. The massive rear bumper needed some more love, and I decided when painting it, I wasn't going for perfection. The inhabitants of the Badlands care more about weaponry and lethality of their creations than aesthetics. Kind of like orcs in 40k. World smash win! Try as I might, I was still unhappy with my purple. So I tinted beaten purple very heavily with Shining Mithril, then grabbed periwinkle purple from my Army Painter speed paints and went to work with my airbrush. I chose magic blue when painting the roll cage around the cab and the weapons racking on the rear of this new Nightmare machine. But first, I'd laid down a coat of coal black. It is such a cool color, I'm excited to use it on these evil dwarves that I have planned for a Shadow Dark campaign. But back to the build. After a good base coat of coal black, I went through and covered that with magic blue from Vallejo. To add grit and grime buildup to the truck, I went in a two-step process. The first was mixing baking soda with UV resin, so I could vary the amount easily across the surfaces and really show buildup in any deep pockets. And since UV resin tends to cure very glossy, I needed a way to knock that back. No shiny dirt on this six-wheeled menace. And that's where Noosh from Monument Hobbies came in. I mixed it with some Nightmare Landscapes brown and just started slopping it all over the build. If you haven't seen this done before, don't worry, everything's going to be alright. Much like an oil wash, after a short cure time, I just needed to dab at the truck to remove excess and leave the grime in any areas where water, dirt, and rust would naturally collect. You can repeat this as many times as you'd like to get the required effect, or you can be as sparing with it as you'd like. It is a great way to weather down anything, vehicles, buildings, you name it. And with that, the build's over, and here it is. Project complete, and you're looking at one heavily fortified beast of a vehicle, ready to go do battle. It's been equipped with a big rooftop anti-tank, anti-aircraft missile set. The hood mounted smaller missiles for vehicle-sized targets and taking out enemy roadblocks. It can drop a trail of glue behind it to stop enemies in their tracks, or spray oil to slicken the roadway so enemies slide out of control. Oh yeah, and those massive twin guns out front, they can be machine guns, laser guns, or flamethrowers, whichever the driver and his team mechanics decide. But I've definitely saved the best for last on this big bad bruiser of a vehicle. Anything like this, the military always gives them a really cool name. And the name of this, the HM318. Well, that's it for me for another video. Please share, like, and subscribe. Likes and shares go a long way, helping me so much to keep this channel growing. Your comments are always welcome. If you'd like, you can drop a donation into my Ko-fi account. The tip in the tip jar would be much appreciated. And then I guess see you next time. As always, I'm Wes, and this is Wesardry.